The following is an SAT long passage question that is asking us for which statement most detracts from the main point of a passage. In this case, we're referring to passage 2, which has something very particular to say about deaf culture. If you have noticed, every time that you deal with a long passage section, you're going to find a very clear thesis. And after you've read the passage, you probably reread the first paragraph and the first sentence of the second paragraph in search of this thesis. It will oftentimes be rewarded in one way or another in the answer choices for main point questions or inference questions. In this case, though, we're looking for what would detract from the thesis, so something that would go directly against it. So let's go ahead and check that out. Most deaf people are given the education and support that they need to live full and happy lives with rewarding social relationships and successful careers. After reading this passage, you would see that this is somehow not what we're arguing for. It's sort of the opposite. Nonetheless, it is foolish and misguided to think of deafness as anything but a disability, which is precisely what deaf culturists do. This is the main point of the passage here, that thinking of deaf culturists as a good thing is bad because deaf culturists think that being deaf is not merely a disability, but something else, that it's a culture, that it's an environment that you can immerse yourself in. The author of this passage then, if you take this sentence literally, would think that people who believe these things are both foolish and misguided. And you know that this is the case because if you look at the topic sentences of the passage, and let's just look at these two for time's sake, it starts with, in one sense, deaf culture is a positive thing, but then it's followed by, however, deaf culture also encourages the deaf to reject both the hearing world and those deaf people who aren't participants in deaf culture. So it's definitely against here. And then we've got this second one here. For example, many deaf people dismiss the idea of teaching deaf children how to speak or read lips. And this, again, this example is an example of this however section, that deaf culture also encourages the deaf to reject the hearing and to other deaf people who don't participate in deaf culture. So it's definitely a bad thing. Foolish and misguided is what we're talking about here. So let's go ahead and look at these answer choices. When deaf children attend only deaf schools, future interaction with the hearing community is extremely unlikely. This wouldn't detract from the author's point of view. In fact, it's exactly why the author believes that having deaf children adhere to this deaf culture ideal is a bad thing because they don't interact with other people. So that only backs up the author's claim. Deaf children do not thrive in an integrated environment dominated by hearing peers. The fact that they don't thrive isn't exactly what the author is talking about. In fact, if children didn't thrive in an environment dominated by hearing peers, it would be a good thing for children not to try to integrate themselves into that environment because they would feel lesser, they wouldn't thrive, they wouldn't have the resources available for them to be successful. So it would be a good thing then for deaf culture to exist, which is not what the passage is arguing for. That's why B would be the right answer. But let's go ahead and consider the others. A number of studies show that deaf children, once they immerse themselves in deaf culture, limit their contact with hearing relatives. This is bad. You want children to be able to relate with their relatives. So deaf culture would be taking something really important away, and that's exactly what the author is saying, that it's foolish and misguided to be a deaf culturist. Deaf schools do their students a disservice if they fail to teach speaking techniques. Same idea, separating from the hearing. Most deaf people who don't learn to speak can only find employment within deaf institutions. Again, the problem here is not that the deaf can only find employment with other deaf people, which would then, encourage interaction between deaf people, but the fact that the deaf who don't learn how to speak can't do it. We want people to learn how to speak, including deaf people, according to, the author of this passage, as much as they can, of course. So it's a bad idea to tell deaf people not to learn to communicate with others. So that answer choice doesn't work out either, and B is the correct answer choice. I hope that helped with this passage, and happy prepping.